sometimes gets double interpretation, and in this discussion we find ourselves moving from one sense to another, as happened in the first session already. Let us be more precise. There are two entities, two systems. There is the threat of missiles and rockets in Israel, and there is the other of missile means against such means. But mainly missiles against missiles. These are two separate issues in their problematics. One word about the missile threats. There is absolutely no shadow of doubt, when we look at this in hindsight, that our adversaries identified this loophole in the Israeli defense. They identified, actually after the shooting in the first Gulf War, when the dislocation was seen, the dislocation that actually caused the launching of a few dozens of launches with the nuclear warheads, a bit larger than a bomb carried by a plane. They could say at the time, they saw this, and if they drew the conclusion, they probably will take this direction. But the phenomenon expanded later on, and we need not document the great number of manners of threats of missiles against Israel, but just say one thing. The sum total is very big. If we take paramilitary organization like the Hamas or Hezbollah, through conventional states, although the uses were not conventional often, like Iraq, Syria, to the threats in the future that are not conventional in essence, if we join everything together and see to what extent Israel is vulnerable, then the missile threat is a huge issue that poses challenges of non-parallel. We needn't speak too much about that. But regarding missile defense against missiles, that is active defense, here the question is much more complex. First and foremost, because this did not yet take on skin and sinews. There are beginnings, there are possibilities, there are options. But here, this has not been done. And the adversary is less, and amongst us only in the very preliminary stages. So the question to be asked is this what we are in for in the future? To what extent the missiles against missiles will be central in reducing the missile threats? But when we think historically, we cannot feel free of all kind of questions that accompany the controversy overseas or even in Israel. Think how much in the past, in view of all those pressures, Israel was pushed into a defensive position that was far-reaching, much more than any other state. For instance, in the 50s, we were in a binge of building shelters. The entire state, they were digging here, they were digging there, in the cities, and then those shelters were neglected. But in the 50s, the number of shelters that were dug in schools, in towns and cities was amazing. And I believe that we were in a situation that the number of Israeli civilians who have shelter services is higher than any other state in the world. In the 90s, vis-à-vis the possibility of use of chemical arm, we distributed gas masks. Unprecedented way. No country in the world was exposed to such chemical threat that decided to equip the entire civilian population with gas masks. There was a lot of controversy. But the fact is that the Israeli response was most generous. Those gas masks were given out to everyone, to places where we knew the gases would not be used, but we did it sometimes for social reasons, etc. In the 90s, vis-à-vis increasing terrorism, we came to large extent of putting up fences and walls. This became the end-all and be-all of everything. And I know no other place where fencing or building walls became such a central political issue that was fortune-consuming and became something so central. And now, with all these means, we are adding the different domes that we would like to have, iron domes for active defense. If we follow the programs that we have, or the plans that we have, we will be able to say that Israel here, too, is deploying to itself a defensive means in a scope that no other country has. It's really interesting. It's a historical notion that goes 60 years backward. Our willingness to invest resources in those non-military defensive means, technological or logistic or others, is really far-reaching. And what does it mean about our approach to security? Because at the end of the day, the defense is not the most promising position. Very rarely is it enough. When you see such an urge for defense in the Israeli behavior, we need to think. And regarding the controversy about missiles against missiles, we know that this took place in the West in a few ways, in the 60s, in the 80s, and always almost was determined against. But when you ask yourself why the answer was against, you find different reasons. There was a big argument that will probably go on regarding technological feasibility. This will be addressed today. Often, there was a situation where the obstacles were on the background of efficiency and budgets. This too, I believe, will be discussed here. But often, the obstacles were not the first and the second one, but the context. Some of them were mentioned. That is, how does this integrate amongst all other ingredients of defense? Because what turned out is that not always is this aggregate. Not always can you say that deterrence is stronger or gets stronger by active defense. For instance, the big argument, controversy in the US, they decided against active defense because they said that it cuts deterrence and hurts the stability in general. So that the curves of return, it says that we don't have to go to the comfort zone with one thing supports another, but the points of fulcrum, of balance, had to be found. Or it's not one thing that comes at the expense of the other, or a technology that can be resolved. But when one security mission is eroded by promoting another mission, and that was something which accompanied the problem of defense against missiles and is around today. To what extent you're doing it at the expense of the offensive capability, and to what extent it pushes you into passive orientation, and to what extent it causes instability. And this is already in the other world. As Amidror said, the nuclear world sometimes sounds the very opposite, but even in the non-nuclear world, you have to examine these things and define the answers. And I will conclude by saying, one can say, okay, we got it. We have very serious dilemmas here. We have a need to choose. Let's find the optimization. Let's find a balance. It looks as the right call for action. This is what is actually happened, is that we get compromise, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and we believe that this should be called optimization. But let me remind you that sometimes here, compromises are worse than their absence. Like Eshkol used to say, half coffee, half tea would give you something, some kind of drink, of no drink at all. So a compromise that gives you a quarter of the system and half capability is not the right response. So even the quest for packages of optimum is not always the line that we should follow. And sometimes we should distance ourselves into corner positions from the kind that, for good reason or not, we're doing in the nuclear era, when all the weight was about deterring without defense. I'm not saying that this is the answer in our case, but in view of the very natural, very immediate threat and its dilemmas that don't skip us, and the kinds of answers, including missiles against missiles, the problems are really very complex. So we are very lucky to have amongst us General Ivry and General Bodinger, because maybe in their response, for their background, they will touch upon those things that I just brought up. I will invite first General Ivry.
Good afternoon. The first two opening comments. First of all, the defense ought to be active, because I don't think that we can talk or recommend about passive and going under bunkers and tunnels under the ground, although one ought to think about that as well, perhaps. But I do not represent the Air Force stand as it does appear here. I think in many cases my opinion was very different and very opposed to what the Air Force thought, and I'm going to present it here. And there were long periods where there was a complete disagreement between me and my opinions and that of the active defense in the Air Force. The question is, where does active defense come in against surface-to-surface missiles? When we talk about the army power, the constraints, restrictions of budget, and how does one add? Uzi spoke about compromise. Maybe a compromise doesn't help whatsoever. That's what Uzi said. So perhaps we ought to look in hindsight at what we did. We had other provocative questions that came up at the time. For example, the Scads cost over $100,000. The Arrow is $2 million, or a missile, so you're going to waste $1 million. You're going to waste $100,000 for every $1 million. So if we don't have the active one, then we won't have the money for the offensive. And of course, people used to always quote Ben-Gurion's doctrines, who said that one has to transfer the war as early as possible to the army territory. In other words, offensive. But they forgot that Ben-Gurion was the first who determined what was the regional defense was, and he is the one who brought in those specific missiles over from Germany that he did, because he felt that it was a must. It was incumbent upon us in order to be able to give the directives for the offensive, because if you don't have that kind of regional defense, then the tanks would be in and deployed all over Israel even before you managed to recruit your reserves. So true, we haven't got a strategic depth like the States has, but we do have one, some of it partially in time, partially in the field itself. So of course, during times of campaign we always had it, but so you have a certain strategic depth, which is minimal, and the moment you need to immediately mobilize the reservists within 48 hours so that you'd have an active defense, either in the land forces, the ground forces, or air force, so that you can immediately go over and transfer to an offensive stage. But without active defense, you can't actually find yourselves in an offensive stance. But now this is an era, this is a rocket and missile era. And the strategic depth is basically zero, because you haven't got the 48 hours. It's immediate. From the moment the war is waged, it's immediate rockets that start salvoing over. You've lost your strategic depth. What it means is that you have to increase your active defense in order to enable the offensive situation, because that's the aim, isn't it, at the end of the day? So if you're talking, there are 5 phases. You've got the intelligence, they're all advanced, and I'm talking about tactical and defensive issues. The better the intelligence is, then those 5 strata need less investment. You've got the early warning issue, you need the radar, you've got the red shachar, as we call it in Sderot. You want to have the warning, for example, of launching from Iraq, that we had 3.5 minutes in those times. In other words, those early warning systems that you have time to prepare yourself, and less necessity in the passive warning. The next strata is the passive, then you've got the active defense, and then you've got the offensive. So if you're talking about a response to a foe, then you've got to have a response for all those 5 strata to a certain degree. Even the Air Force that claimed that we said is based and structured on offensive, it had, don't forget that underground tunnels and hangars. It was able so that they would immediately have runways, and they'd be able to have certain runways always open to take off. They bought the Hawks, and we've also got the security fence, and we're managing to shield our buses against the stone throwers. The stones don't cost any money, but we're spending millions on that shield just so that we'll be able to move over to offensive. In other words, that defensive, that passive defense and that offensive, the less passive defense you have, then you'll have to be ready for some kind of active defense, because otherwise you're going to pay a very heavy price at the end of the day. And you're paying for those cement structures that you were supposed to be defending, and could have been spent on other things beforehand. In other words, there's a balance in these setups as well. And don't forget, it's the offensive in the end that has that actually decides in the campaign. How does one create an offensive when you don't have a mutual border, a joined border with, or for example with Iraq or Iran, when you don't have a joint border with that enemy? It's not the same tools that we spoke about or mentioned beforehand. What are you talking about? What? Controlling a territory and being in the field in Iran or Iraq? So therefore, this whole issue of offensive has also been transformed, not in the previous meaning of a transformation, because it could have been similar in Syria and Lebanon, but the comprehensive model is totally different. What happened in the Arab countries, or with our neighbors? I can talk from 82 onwards, because we mentioned history. After the Taka was decided, then they knew that the next war would definitely be a surface-to-surface missile. So we waited a little bit. We bided our time with our active defense, and they slowly, now of course, they have decided their Air Force can't do as what we can do, so they've gone for the surface-to-surface missiles, and they've developed them over the last 20 years. So when you start going into this whole issue of surface-to-surface missiles where you can attack another country with long range, then you find additional alternatives as well. First you take dozens of them, because you think a ballistic missile is something horrific, and then you find out that 40 missiles didn't actually create strategic damage. There was damage, but not strategic. So you can put the missiles on the sort of you can put them in the depth of other areas from the borders of the Iranian border, and you can even shoot out from there with a salvo on Tel Aviv. So you have to try and think of the point. It's not that I'm against the surface-to-surface missiles, and on the conventional level, you've got to try and find some way of having active defense systems, because if you don't have that active defense, then the powers to be are pressurized into going out on some kind of offensive campaign, sometimes not at the right time, and certainly not from a political point of view. So what gives you It's an active defense. This gives you time to think of the military and political background so that you can reorganize and restructure yourselves for a military campaign at the right time. So therefore the balances have changed. Number one, the strategic depth is nil, and the war immediately is waged against the home front. Number three, you have a problem with the issue of shared or joint borders, and now the threat can be shot further, much further than just on the front. On the front, it's now on the home front. So you've got to have 100% or hermetically if you think you can provide that hermetically sealed defense, then it's impossible, because it's based and structured on all 5 levels. Intelligence, warning, and we're not investing in warning. We're doing some kind of improvisation from our intelligence and our technological abilities, and we say, give us some kind of sign. We call it the Red Dawn. What was it born of? It's from other techniques that we had. We're sort of improvising it. And in the Gulf War, we had some help from the United States, because it's not an enormous investment. And the alternatives that you've got to discuss with weighted discussions is that you need the passive, the active defense, and the offensive, because without them, I mean, you can't not shield a bus when stones are being thrown at them. You've got to decide how much you can do with everything else in mind. But if I'm talking about active defense, then you've got to select what kind of active defense. Our active defense, when we kept a clean sky open, with hawks and other combat fighters, airplanes, others that could react more slowly, for example, over Dimona. Because in active defense we could be better. In other words, you've got to combine the two with your battle aircraft, because they were more versatile. You could put bombs in them, you could missiles, you could put rockets in them. They could all be airborne, and you could prepare your planes according to all the qualifications of a first-class combat fighter airplane, so that you'd take your defense and you turned it into an offensive ability and a capacity. Yes, you've got the abilities of the F-15I, and only a very small percentage of our fleet are full bombers, because you didn't buy them and said, okay, they have to be ready for interception, but you took active defense planes and you made them offensive planes. And that was, for example, 190 went out with bombs during the war. All of them were combat pilots. And that was our versatility. So you have to understand that what is our future active defense? How versatile can we be in it? We have to be ready to shoot down missiles with missiles, and that's not versatile. It's again one layer, and some of them are against another layer. In other words, our active defense of today is a conceptual mistake. It's an erroneous assumption. We have to do it because of a certain situation. But it would have been correct to go towards the idea of lasers, because they're light speed, and there are other things against the cruise missiles or the UAVs and all the unmanned ones. You've got other possibilities as well with your lasers. That's the directed energy issue. And all the mistake was that we didn't continue with all those laser systems that we started manufacturing in the 90s. And therefore, all this direction that we ought to invest in it, if we're talking about light speed, the speed of light, that gives you the right ranges, that gives you various possibilities, and of course there's the laser possibilities as well, but that's the future. The first block perhaps won't be the best, the second maybe even less, but the third will be much better. And why? Because we're talking about light speed rather than 3 or 4 other kind of levels of speed. And don't forget that there are issues of fog and mist that have to be measured as well. Don't forget that missiles also have constraints and restrictions. But the most important issue is that the quantitative issue is an issue of tremendous importance. Don't forget that the other side, they have no restriction, constraint. If they want 11,000, it could be 110,000 in the future. They've got the ability. And a laser is a tool wherein you use your electric power station energy. You don't need storage rooms or emergency storage rooms deployed everywhere. Different logistics altogether.
Therefore, this is the direction of active defense that we should take: versatility, other capabilities, directed energy, which is both aggressive, and I don't want to go into other options. So these are the directions that we should follow. And today, we are hearing the penalty, and the penalty is strategic and political, because we have two prototypes. One is Sderot and one in Ashkelon. Hamas wouldn't have any strategic value. But they did not decide to bring it here. Qassam, they shoot about 10, 12 a day. The Nautilus system could give an answer to these, the 2 minutes or 2 seconds. And then they had Salvo Impossible, then the 3 Katyusha were given in as a feasibility is there. I'm not saying it is cheap. The price we're paying is much higher in concrete, in the situation of Sderot, and in strategic situation. This is why I believe that this would be the right direction. When we lag behind, we pay double. We have to go also dealing with the rocket system, and there are some other problems involved that I don't want to go into. But these are the right directions to follow. And I don't want to say that it is a system of this or that company. No, I'm speaking about the right direction that we should follow. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David and Herzl, Major General Herzl Bodinger. Good afternoon. I subscribe to all that David said, and I would like to add what I've chosen and speak slightly differently on some points. Beforehand, I'd like to relate to previous statements regarding awareness amongst the law public in the State of Israel regarding the threats and the need to handle it with a defense. And to the best of my agreement, there is no consensus here. And still there are many who are even opposed to it. And I would like, upon this stage, from this stage, to congratulate Avi Shneur, who in the United States dealt with missile defense, and he made Aliyah, and he initiated the setting up of association after he retired and not working in it anymore, out of the concern of what is going on in our region. And he set up this association and appealed to us and asked us to join, and my acceptance is actually joining him in the understanding that this is a very important topic, and our purpose in the association is to increase awareness and expand it and encourage industry as well. With your permission, I'll say something that are quite known, and I'll repeat something that many in this room know. I'm saying this for the sake of some of our friends here who are not familiar with these topics and were not involved in them so far. So from the others, I ask to bear with me. Let's begin with the facts. I determine here that the main reason for the introduction of missiles to the Middle East in the big numbers that we are experiencing as a defensive and offensive missile is the Israeli Air Force. And another fact, from the inception of the state, since that time until today, We've succeeded in setting up an air force that is capable of flying over all the Middle East and bombard any target that will be defined and do it successfully. The foe countries are not capable of stopping us, and their air forces cannot attack Israeli territory except for a few cases when this already happened, and this with efficiency close to nil. At a certain time that started in the war of attrition, they succeeded, as they think, to defend themselves from our planes with a surface-to-air systems. And at the end of the day, on the Yom Kippur War in 1973, they even thought that they found the ultimate solution to this problem, that our Air Force roams their skies. In 1982 Lebanon War, under David Ivri as Air Force commander, we destroyed all the batteries of the Syrian defense system against airplanes, and we did it without losing one aircraft. And in dogfights that developed later, we downed more than 80 planes without losing one aircraft. This was something that was debriefed by the Syrians, and it was very embarrassing. It made them conclude that the problems posed by the Israeli Air Force needs to be solved not by aircraft, but in another way, and attacking Israeli territory can be done only through surface-to-surface missiles. And thus, in 1984, they started setting up the big array that we know today, the array of hundreds of missiles located in the depth of Syrian territory, well protected by tunnels, and this is the strategic array on which they rely for future wars. We should remind that in 1973 already, in the Yom Kippur War, the Syrians, launched for 3 nights missiles to the Ramat Aviv Air Force bases. They did not hit in the first 2 nights, but in the third they did. And for them, these were the only offensives done on Israeli soil. Taking care of this new day when they set up SSM was then decided by Chief of General Staff Moshe Levy, and was imposed on the Air Force as part of a defense carried out, or that should be carried out by the Air Force. And the solution chosen was offensive, charting the Syrian bases, building passive protection of sites in Israel, and about the same time, an active idea was by the Arrow as part of a solution against multi-layer solution against surface-surface missiles. As is known in many cases in history, vis-a-vis every innovation, and there were many people who were opposed to the Chetz. And I'll mention some of the arguments. One is that the attack is the best way of defense. Number 2, that it was incorrect, economically speaking, to intercept a Scud missile by launching such an expensive missile like Chetz, like the Arrow. By the way, we do not just fight the missile itself, but the damage it can cause. And also, number 3, that we'll never have enough arrows in order to fence off the hundreds of missiles that can be on the way to attack us. I'll be willing to entertain questions about this. Against each one of these contentions, there were and there are answers, but those who claimed them succeeded in one thing at least, and that is to slow down the promotion of active defense development. And this went into a slowdown and deep freeze and developed very slowly. And thus, we came across the launching of 40 missiles from A3 regions in Iraq in winter 91 on cities like Tel Aviv, and vis-a-vis this surprise that was very surprising, the Americans posed very fast the Patriot missiles of the first model that were not right for the job and didn't intercept not even one Scud. However, this event brought about acceleration of the Arrow project, which today is operational, and the Patriot Model 3, which are capable of intercepting SSM. Iraq's success in attacking Israel deep in its territory and the trauma it left on the Israeli public, it's true that people did not get killed. It's true that the damage was not that big or not big enough, but that raised a big storm. This encouraged the Syrians to continue and equip themselves with thousands of such missiles, as well as other countries who followed suit. The next surprise came from the terror organizations. Hezbollah were the pioneers in equipping themselves with Katyusha and launching them to Israeli cities and towns, Kiryat Shmona in the north, and Nahariya, preferably. Here, too, we, as expected, we only opted for the attack, retaliation, and causing big damage, destruction, if they dare attack civilians in the state of Israel. This is a threat, as was said by Ami Dror, that you cannot stand behind. And such a threat, if you cannot follow suit, it better not be said. We are a democratic state with a democratic orientation. We have no capability of retaliating foe countries, not technically but practically, lest the innocent people, as they call them here, get hurt. However, Hezbollah never stopped launching rockets to the northern border settlements, because this was for them the only alternative to have terror against us, having no possibility in crossing the border. They tried with ground forces, but now the border is blocked to them. They tried through the sea and the Rosh Nikra area, and even land. We remember the gliders, the night of the glide. The residents started leaving Kiryat Shmona. The Prime Minister at the time, Shimon Peres, appealed to Bill Clinton, the President of the U.S., requesting him to develop together active defense system, and there was a common joint project with a laser beam, the Nautilus that David Ivry mentioned. And here too, the doubts rose again in the need itself. And rockets, they said, are not an existential threat. Now, it's rockets. And Amidor mentioned the damage that they can cause. They have no real influence on the result of a war, and investing in systems against them is not justified. In the year 2000, with the pullout of IDF from Lebanon, it seemed that there was no more threat of rockets. They stopped firing rockets for some time, because we said that if Hezbollah dare launch rockets now, we are going to attack in such might that they've never known. You remember all these threats. Such declarations, such statements, we believed, would deter them from launching rockets against Israel, and our continued development of the laser system was stopped. With the pullout of IDF from Lebanon, we froze the budget for security, and we also stopped other developments. You remember, because it didn't have any immediate goal, and amongst this included is this laser system. Our foes in the Middle East did not think like us. Rockets and missiles went on being the only weapon with which they could hurt targets in the territory of Israel without us doing anything efficient against them. The great penalties that we threatened with could not be implemented for human considerations. I said that. And thus, in the south too, in the Gaza sector, the Hamas adopted the rockets, whose performance is quite meager, but they are a terrible badger against the civilians, and we as a state must not put up with this. But still, this is not a solution. And then in summer 06, last summer, we were forced last year to sustain in a conflict on the border from Hezbollah 4,000 different rockets in the north without our ability to do anything through the army. This again struck at the Israeli society more than the real mathematical value of these things. And our main lesson from the Second Lebanon War, if I want to choose one lesson, is that the State of Israel has a problem vis-à-vis missiles of different kinds. On the other side, the conclusion of Hezbollah that radiates to all Arab states is that Israel has a problem vis-à-vis missiles. That means they acted right when they devoted efforts to develop rockets and missiles against Israel. And their conclusion was that they would continue to equip themselves with thousands of these rockets and missiles, threatening to use them against us in every conflict. And they are doing this as we speak. I hope not. Let us refer back to Iran's statements and Hezbollah and so on. If what I said is true, then we need to prepare ourselves with passive protection by building shelters and in active defense through launching missiles and rockets and attacking infrastructure and sites from which such rockets are operated. Not dealing with this, claiming that this would be a waste and the solution will be only attacking or offense by penalizing, by destroying enemy infrastructure is a mistake. Unless we know how to reduce, I'm not saying to do away, reduce the number of rockets and missiles, there is a danger that beyond the level of certain damage, the Air Force will get an instruction to turn all their Air Force ability to attack. In this scenario, all the orders are harnessed in the enemy against the Air Force, and they will reduce our ability in attacking targets that help the war. It was said here, without expanding, I will tell you that such constraints that cause not a very efficient operation of the Air Force because of something else that happened in the past as well, and we could give another lecture on that. In conclusion, I would like to say two more comments. Number one, we must not dilly-dally in developing rockets and missiles of all sorts. Number two, in a war, we need to pose such system for the defense of strategic facilities, military and civilian, a priority for the defense of the residents that can be sheltered or evacuated from regions according to the need. All that I've said so far is being discussed. There is no consensus, nothing is monolithic here. And in stating that this is necessary and need to be taken care of ASAP, and our role or the target for the association is to persuade, to convince that this is something absolutely necessary and critical. I would like to remind us that we are acting in a democracy, and a democracy behaves as a ship. It takes time to take a new direction, and we are actually calling upon taking the right decisions and taking the helm into one's hands and putting it in the right direction. I believe that this has to be officially imposed on the Air Force, and I believe that the Air Force will take this assignment, and then we will have the right response. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Your last sentence brought us back to understand why this session was named the Air Force Outlook. But things were extremely to the point, and I think that we could now devote about a few minutes to 3 or 4 pinpointed questions. So could the audience please tell us who you're asking and what the questions are? Into microphones, please. Ladies and gentlemen. I have a question. 2 questions. My first question is, Major General Bodinger said that he would like this mission to be officially handed over to the Air Force to deal with such encroachment, such risk. That is contrary to what is, from what I understand, what is happening to the Air Force at the moment. The Air Force does not want to take upon itself, that task, and therefore I think it should be blended with the ground forces. And now the second question is to Major General Ivry. Would it be possible at this phase, as one says in English, haven't the trains already left the station? The Ministry of Defense, after so many years of analysis and research, and they've already embarked on the journey with the David Sling and the Iron Dome missiles, how practically could we actually establish a project based on solid-state laser? Could we practically try and contain what has happened and do something about it? The doubts about the technological capacity. Since I have experienced it myself, because I went into the headquarters after the Yom Kippur War in the Air Force, and the motto at the time was the SAM could actually dent the plane. I was in a position where the land forces says one shouldn't rely on the Air Force anymore. They took mechanics and other people and they said, come on, let's create other artillery command and land forces, and we worked quietly, and the journalists used to keep asking me time and time again, what is your response to the SAM? What is your response to the SAM? But we proved that we did have it in 82, that it's a technological response. It's not in daring and courage that perhaps you need as well, but it's a technological response. We have no alternative but to have technological supremacy over the other side. That's why we did the visibility study with the Nautilus, which was the first master stereotype. They thought, would it be possible to try and follow for 2 seconds follow a Katyusha because of its heat, because its enclosure is thick, and to follow it for 2 seconds, following it because of its heat enclosure, and then we'd be able to achieve it. And yes, they proved that one could do it, and they were all original Katyushas that we actually managed to. So it is feasible. Yes, it's something that we did the visibility test. Maybe the maintenance wasn't good enough, but it was in 96, 98. This is 10 years have elapsed since then. And therefore, you've got the solid state, you've got the IBL since then, and the ITL, and the tactical laser that's also going to be airborne soon, that are developing in the areas with directed energies, which are extremely effective. So I don't want to start going in all to the technological cutting-edge domains, but it exists in the stability after the follow-through of the actual ray, and which laser beam do you want to appropriate. That's also something that can be followed through. Had we gone for that fast master type, don't forget that the Arrow missile is not similar now at the moment to the one we had previously, so it's now already the Block 3 that we've been developing. Only when you don't believe in it, then you don't promote it, and therefore the technological issue is something that can be solved. Will the laser give 100% response? No, it has certain haze or mist responses, but you don't always have mist and haze and fog in situations coming out of the Gaza Strip. So, to a certain degree, it is. And now I'd like to touch on other things. I'll take this opportunity. Now, when you said a preemptive strike, the more we advance in globalization, our restrictions vis-à-vis the external, the world outside, from a political, economic point of view, then our preemptive strike becomes harder and harder. We have to find a solution to the higher echelons of power that does not require a preemptive strike. I mean, after all, we find ourselves in a situation where we're in a region where there could be thousands of missiles, as the ones we're talking about, with chemical warheads that exist. Now, when are you going to decide on your preemptive strike? these questions are a lot tougher than we even think. And they're becoming even more complex and tougher. I'm not opposed to the idea of a preemptive strike as a military man. I've always thought about that, and I always believed in it. But as a democratic state, when part of the global village that exists, then you have so many more restrictions, a plethora of them, much more than you think, including the dependence and the reliance on the United States and other countries. And therefore this preemptive strike as a concept is correct, but it's actually not feasible in most of the cases and most of the scenarios. Now, remaining in the field. True, if you remain in the field, it does prevent Katyushas, but it has another price to pay. It's a political price, a terror price, and you've got to find a solution that you won't have to find yourselves in the field, remaining in the field. It's a kind of sort of last case scenario, okay? So we have to be there. We want to find another solution. I want to defend and protect Nahariya, Kiryat Shmona and the north with so many units. And don't forget, don't misunderstand, you can't protect everyone, but you have to be remember when you're ready to go out on an offensive. You have to prepare your military, your political background, and you do it through weighted considerations and readiness and preparedness. And therefore just staying in the field, staying in the territory, the moment perhaps we haven't got an alternative, though I don't think that prevents Katyushas in any settled area, if it's in Tyre or Sidon or anywhere else. But at the moment we have no alternative. We've got to create that alternative, so we're not committed to be in the field. And I think I said at the very beginning, I said they have 10 missiles at the beginning, because a missile is not so horrific. But what leads them, what is now motivating them, is that they want thousands of them, and they want the chemical warheads. They know that just a few, the Al-Hussein, won't bring about the collapse of the State of Israel. But if you're talking about the chemical warheads, that's a different situation. And I'm not saying what our reaction would be, but therefore they're now pushing themselves towards the non-conventional ones, because they know that the ballistic missiles do not give them that decisive blow that they were hoping for. And that's extremely grave, and therefore we have to have active defense. Thank you very much.
General Bodinger will be the last one to respond. Microphone, please. No, I'm sorry. Has to be spoken to the microphone. I cannot hear, and therefore I cannot translate. I'm sorry, I cannot translate the question. The gentleman is not speaking to the microphone. He's asking whether the system is going to be introduced to the State of Israel or not. Are we going to go for it or not? That's in essence. Yaakov Agassi is the one who asked the question. He was my commander when I was a pilot in Ramat David base. Let me answer you. To the best of my knowledge, I have no transparency into the decision-making process. I can only say what I know. And I started when I spoke and related to 1996 when I was the Air Force commander. When I was towards the end of my term, there was a time when Shimon Peres was Minister of Defense and Prime Minister, since Rabin, unfortunately, was assassinated. And we were then, after two big operations in Lebanon against Hezbollah. One was Grapes of Wrath, and the other was, I forgot the name, by an air blockade. We we created a situation where everything was frozen in the area. The villages in southern Lebanon were abandoned. The civilians ran north, and within a few days the fire was over. It simply dwindled. We, of course, explained how we had done it, and that we did not intend to hurt innocent people, which is true. And then in the next operation, it didn't work. Then nobody deserted any village, and we were bombarding in the suburbs of the villages, so to speak. Over time, there were some logistical problems, but it didn't succeed as well as in the first case. The first time it didn't succeed was last year. That was a total failure. Taking into account the fact that rockets fell on Haria and Rosh Hanikra, Shimon Peres turned to President Clinton. We have a movie where they decided on the Nautilus. It was 1996, April, if I'm not mistaken. And that was a new Israeli-American project that within 4 years, in the year, there was a prototype that we gave at the Katyusha film. They intercepted all the missiles, including in salvos. And then I'm learning from Avi Schneer, who was the head of the project in the US. At that time, they said, let's put the system in a more difficult test, a challenge. And cannon shells were fired against it. All of them were downed. So we said, let's do another mortar, short range. It did them in too. So in the prototype, 46 different projectiles were downed very successfully, 100% success. This is well known here, and nobody doubts it. It's true that it is a prototype. A prototype is big. It's true it has many limitations of a prototype, but we intended to develop the next stage. But then we pulled out of Lebanon, so the validity was dwindled, and then it was pushed aside. And the budget also went down. I believe that the project was not renewed, although there were some suggestions to do so. I have no absolute transparency, so I cannot give you a better answer. I only can tell you what I know, and that was a very, very good system. Please make sure you speak into a microphone. I'm sorry. Of the Nautilus project stemmed from two reasons. One, the project, as you described, was joined to us and the Americans. And indeed, after the successes that you stressed, there was another test in 2002. The Americans said, we are stopping the project. And they froze it and stopped budgeting it. And I, as Director General of the Ministry of Defense at the time, said, we will carry on. And we did so another year, and I budgeted our part. But then the big budgetary blast came in the defense budget. And then, according to the opinion of all those seated here, that was the right priority. That had nothing to do with the pullout from Lebanon or of neglecting or poo-pooing the threat. The pullout of Lebanon is a fact. I didn't speak about poo-pooing or really making light of the threat, says Bodinger. I believe that if we had had more a rain of missiles, we would have treated the whole matter differently. The budget, the defense budget was different too. That is correct. We are just in